Good evening. Thank you for joining us in this virtual home of the Faculty of Law at Monash University. I seem somehow, without trying, to have dressed in the colour palette of the slide behind me. We are here to celebrate the launch of a new book, Corporate Social Responsibility in an Age of Existential Threats, published by Monash University Publishing this month, August 2025. With the author Bryan Horrigan, Professor of Law at Monash and former Dean of the Faculty. For those I've not met before, I'm Steven Vaughan. I'm the new-ish Dean of the Faculty. It is very much my privilege to open the event and to welcome you all. I'm coming to you tonight from Paran, so let me begin by acknowledging that I'm meeting you on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. Let me pay my respects to elders past and present, and let me extend those respects to all of our Indigenous guests at this book launch. Tonight we will be reflecting on many aspects of corporate social responsibility, and it strikes me as important to remember that First Nations peoples have over 60,000 years of modelling sustainable ways of living, grounded in reciprocity, respect for country, intergenerational responsibility, and so on. So I have three jobs this evening. My first, which I've done, is to welcome you all. The third I will do in a couple of minutes, which is to introduce our panel of fabulous speakers. And my second task is to introduce the Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, Professor Sharon Pickering, who sadly can't be here this evening, but has recorded a video with her words of support for Bryan and his new book.
Good evening, colleagues, friends, and distinguished guests. I am sorry I cannot be with you live tonight. I would like to acknowledge the Honourable Marilyn Warren, AC, Monash University Publishing's Julia Calamagno and her great team, and most of all, Professor Bryan Horrigan, to celebrate the launch of Bryan's book, Corporate Social Responsibility in an Age of Existential Threats. This is indeed a timely book. The absolute need for corporations and other institutions to act in the interests of our communities and the planet is urgent, as threats from climate change and conflict continue to grow. We find ourselves in a moment when the frameworks we rely on for encouraging sustainable social and environment corporate behaviour are being questioned in an increasingly polarised public debate. In his book, Professor Horrigan draws on his considerable expertise in corporate and public sector governance and law. He brilliantly elucidates the challenges we face and provides practical insights on the way forward. I warmly congratulate Bryan on his book and his commitment to public engagement and service. In a time of rising disinformation and misinformation, when reasoned debate is too easily drowned out by shouting and invective, we need more than ever to encourage informed discussion. It is one of the crucial roles of our universities as enduring and foundational pillars of society and democracy. Thank you, Bryan, for your invaluable contribution, not just through this book, but across your esteemed career. My very best wishes for the launch.
So my second task, having done the introduction, is now to move on to brief biographies of our panel. I will keep them brief because we could take up the whole hour with many achievements and accolades. So our chair of the panel this evening is the Honourable Professor Marilyn Warren, ACKC. As many of you will know, she served as Chief Justice of Victoria from 2003 to 2017, following a long and distinguished career dedicated to legal service and, perhaps just as importantly, as a champion squash player. After her retirement from the bench, Chief Justice Warren joined Monash as Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Fellow and has been invaluable when it comes to leadership and teaching on our commercial and international arbitration programs and units. Our second panelist for this evening is Professor Simon Wilkie, who is Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics. In the pre-meeting for this evening's book launch, we were talking about the fact that a group of deans is called a decanter, which I think is perfectly appropriate. Simon's distinguished career includes roles as Chief Economic Policy Strategist at Microsoft, Chief Economist at the US Federal Communications Commission, and I think of particular relevance for this evening, Simon has been driving a vision for his faculty strategy of becoming a trusted partner in solving great societal challenges, an approach that he characterizes as the virtuous cycle of engagement, research, and impact. And now on to the main event. Let me now speak about Professor Bryan Horrigan, the author of the book we are launching this evening, a noted academic leader with a stellar career in education, university leadership, and public policy. Also, I think, a stellar career in tennis to sit alongside Chief Justice Warren's stellar career in squash. I'm not sure about Simon's sporting prowess, but no doubt it will come up. No, I'm sorry, Simon, it won't come up this evening. No sports for Simon. Bryan was Dean of the Faculty of Law at Monash from 2013 to 2024, becoming the longest serving dean in the faculty's 60-year history, and he's now a special advisor to the Vice Chancellor. As I think we'll hear more of this evening, his scholarship and policy making have been focused on corporate responsibility and regulation, sustainable governance, making this book both a strong reflection of his career to date and a bold call for new thinking about CSR into the future. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists. Marilyn, I think it's over to you as chair.
Well, thank you very, very much, Stephen, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us tonight. And this particular publication, it's a great small book, very convenient to read when anyone has a quiet moment. And it's written in a way not for lawyers, but for the intelligent reader. And as the Vice-Chancellor and as Stephen have said, it is one of the great topics of our time, and how also very timely given the economic summit that the federal government is holding as we speak. So if I could start with a very simple question for you, Bryan. This book, Corporate Social Responsibility, CSR, what is that?
Well, thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Stephen. When we talk about CSR, we of course have to ask, well, what's a corporation? And a corporation is a collective vehicle for locking in different contributions of capital, intellectual capital, human capital, environmental capital, and so on. And locking in those capital contributions to create value for a business in society. And in doing so, an organisation has various licenses to operate: a legal licence, an economic licence, a social licence, an environmental licence. And so that then takes us to CSR. And there are many definitions about CSR, but in short, as others have said, CSR is basically about how does a corporation relate to the world, and how does the outside world relate to the corporation? And that can take us into lots of debates about corporate responsibility and governance. Conventionally, corporate governance and responsibility has been thought about as a triangular relation between a company, its board, and its shareholders. But of course, there are other stakeholders as well, both within a company, employees, and outside the company, such as creditors and the government and regulators. The view about corporate social responsibility is often thought about in terms of taking account of what became popularised as the triple bottom line. Although the concepts are different, the economic bottom line is associated with shareholder value, and the triple bottom line is associated with economic, social, and environmental considerations. And importantly, given that there's a lot of discussion in the world today about CSR and related concepts, such as environmental and social governance considerations in reporting and decision-making, it's important to note that the S in both CSR and ESG is social. And so it's a very important topic when we talk about corporate governance and responsibility. Why is it so controversial? Well, there's a lot of polarised debate now, as the Vice-Chancellor said, not just in Australia, but also overseas. There's been a backlash internationally against CSR, ESG, and DRI. The Trump administration didn't start this, but the Trump administration has certainly fueled the backlash against DEI and also against certain forms of renewable energy and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. There's a false contrast in much media and political debate in Australia about responsible profit making on one side and irresponsible social engineering on the other side. It's almost as if the conventional view is if you're in favour of profits, then you're in favour of shareholder value. Hooray. And if you're arguing for CSR and ESG and DEI, then you want to engage in some kind of irresponsible social engineering with shareholders' money. Boo. And we've got to get out of the hooray and boo binary debate in which we find ourselves. To the point where at the moment we're in danger of terms like CSR, ESG and DEI becoming terms of abuse. And so that has an impact on people's willingness to talk about those terms and to promote them, both within their own organisations and beyond. And a way that might be familiar for the audience in which these issues come up is politicians on all sides in Australia and elsewhere will refer to a company and its social licence to operate, or business and its social licence to operate, according to their own political agenda. So recently we will have seen the Prime Minister say in the media, in introducing world first regulation on social media platforms about access by children to social media platforms, and the justification from the Prime Minister for this new form of business regulation of world first is social media has a social licence. On the other hand, various politicians told business to stay out of politics on the marriage equality debate and the voice debate. So where you stand on this debate depends on where you sit and what your personal interests are. And that's why it's so controversial.
Well, Simon, can I raise with you? I was very interested earlier this week. The chair of the Productivity Commission, Danielle Wood, at the National Press Club, spoke extensively about growth and seemed to place great emphasis on growth. And as I recall, she put the proposition that perhaps at the end of the day, in all companies, the leaders of the company should ask themselves, what has the company done today for growth? Where does CSR fit in relation to growth?
Thanks, Marilyn. That's a great question. Following up on a theme of Bryan's, I think the two can march hand in hand, that there's not necessarily the binary conflict between them as being presented. To put that in perspective, in the Australian economy, about 9% of the economy of the corporate sector is actually not strict for profit companies. Think of things like superannuation funds, healthcare funds, community banks, agricultural co-ops. Co-ops and mutual societies alone are about 9% of the economy. And so their singular objective is to maximize the welfare of their constituent members, which would necessarily involve the CSR interests being balanced with growth. More generally, if you look at large parts of the economy, again, there isn't necessarily a tension between the two. They can be quite aligned. I mean, I spent some time with Microsoft Corporation. Microsoft is a very much for-profit company, at various times the most profitable, the most valuable corporation in the world. And yet it's very far advanced on its net zero commitment, not just net zero on a particular year output, but rather net zero trying to reverse its entire history of the footprint. And so you can be literally the most profitable company in the world and have fairly strong CSR commitments. So I think growth for growth's sake should not be the objective for corporations. It never should be, but rather, we are trying to maximize the value that the corporation produces for the stakeholders. As Bryan said, the corporation is, a fictional legal creation. It's not a person. So it's a legal vehicle that's constructed to enact a purpose. What is the purpose of that vehicle will vary from vehicle to vehicle. If you're, a growth-oriented hedge fund, then, your purpose is to grow your investors' money that they put into your fund. If you're outside of that, then what is the purpose of the vehicle that's being constructed really should be the existential reason for creating this legal animal.
Bryan, any reflections?
I think the point that Simon has made is really important when it comes to the interests of shareholders, because not only is corporate value and corporate productivity not always a zero-sum kind of equation where you have one or the other, but also when we talk about shareholder value and creating corporate value, there are a couple of other questions we have to ask, which is, are we talking about day traders in shares as shareholders? Are we talking about people who invest for the long term? What's the investment risk profile? What are the various interests of the various shareholders? The modern shareholder for a modern transnational business corporation is quite diverse in terms of characteristics. And so just chanting the mantra shareholder value just leads to other questions about, okay, well, which shareholders and what's their common interest and over what time frame and with what risk appetite and risk profile. And so we need to be getting to those questions, and also the relationship that Simon's indicated between productivity and business value creation, and not assuming, as much of the public and media debate does, that those things are always going to be in conflict or often in conflict. They are sometimes, and it's important to recognize that, but they're often not in conflict. And it's about how does the company as a collective vehicle help to create shared value, for want of a better term.
Bryan, where is the debate being played out? It's been mentioned a number of times this evening, but is it something that is left in the political field? What's happening in academia? Is it something that's talked about in the media? For example, the Australian Financial Review a couple of months ago had a summit on the topic. So where is this controversial discussion occurring?
So that's a great question, Marilyn. And members of the audience would, if they reflect on their own reading of newspapers and media, would know that every day there are stories in newspapers and online about exercises of corporate responsibility or irresponsibility, and court cases and judgments against companies and so on. There's one yesterday against Qantas, but Qantas is not the only company involved in the courts. There's climate litigation, which is mentioned in the courts against companies. So it plays out every day in the newspapers. It plays out in the public debate and the prominence in recent times in Australia of this concept of a social license to operate. And that plays out as well in debates that have gone on in Australia over successive iterations of Australia's corporate governance standards. There is a body called the ASX Corporate Governance Council, which sets the corporate governance standards for all companies that are listed on the Australian Securities Exchange. It's a comply or explain kind of approach where you either comply with the standards or you explain why you're going to diverge from them. And that's about informing the market. But in successive iterations of that set of standards, there have been huge debates about proposals to include and acknowledge a social license to operate for business, about stakeholder engagement, about shareholder value, about references to specific requirements and targets on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. And so this has been a huge part of the corporate governance debate in Australia. And another area which is most important and which is often neglected is the area of corporate law and business regulation. Because many people think that corporate social responsibility is this sort of add-on thing, that it's voluntary and yet you can do it if you want to, but it's the first thing to go when times are tough and finances are tight, or when you really need to focus on something real. But of course, there is now a large part of CSR and ESG that is part of Australian corporate law. For example, it is quite clear that company directors are allowed to take account of stakeholder considerations when they are trying to perform their directors' duties and decide what's in the best interests of the company. Similarly, there are now a number of published legal opinions in Australia and elsewhere that say that if directors of companies mismanage their climate change risk management and disclosures, they breach their directors' duties and may not be entitled to defences. And so beyond Australia, the debate also plays out in geopolitics. So what the Trump administration has done to companies and law firms in America in the recent months of this year, in attacking them if they support DEI, and withdrawing funding from universities that have DEI policies, that has a trickle effect back here in Australia and has affected a number of companies, including companies that operate in America or are part of multinational companies that emanate from America. It's also affected a number of Australian universities who have lost funding because they're involved in projects that relate to DEI. And here we face a question of characterisation. In these public debates, in the academic debates, when we're talking about setting standards, if we take DEI, for example, the one that was so controversial in what the ASX Corporate Governance Council proposed and then abandoned in the face of considerable opposition only a few months ago. When we talk about those things, the problem is that we've got a question of characterisation. One side says diversity, equity and inclusion is essential if we're going to remedy structural discrimination and historical inequities that prevent a level playing field of opportunity. The other side is represented by the Trump administration and indeed in the terminology used by a number of executive orders from President Trump himself only a few months ago, where the other side is put, that DEI, according to the Trump administration, is anti-merit, unethical, and illegal reverse discrimination. And those debates and that kind of language plays out in characterisation questions in Australian debates about these matters as well.
Simon, picking up on what Bryan has just been saying about the debates that are going on, in terms of your faculty and the students that you are educating and training for the future, how is this topic being approached?
So we are one of the signatories of a UN sponsored initiative called PRME. You can pronounce it Prime, just put a fictional I in there, which is the Principles of Responsible Management Education, which is that through our educational offerings, we bring in the idea of CSR responsibilities, not just in at the C-suite, but in all management levels, that people should consider the impact of their activities beyond just profit maximization to all the short-term goals, but to the society that they're operating in at large. They should exercise that authority responsibly, and we've embedded that and embedded an SGG mapping across all of our units. So yeah, I think it's front and center at core of our education. We also have particular opportunities where they can leverage Monash's research. I'm mentioning through our Monash Centre for Financial Studies and the really pioneering work that they've done on scoring firms for their modern slavery policies and their commitment to eliminating that. We also have an interesting research agenda around what we call SODI, the Science of Diversity and Inclusion, which is really practical, looking at what works in what context within the corporation. This was a joint venture between academia and industry with leading diversity champions inside US corporations. Unfortunately, most recently, most of them have lost their jobs.
Oh, that is unfortunate. Well, and I can certainly say from my observations of the law faculty, Bryan did a lot of important work, and now our new dean, Steven, is embedding important topics, in particular climate change, through the curriculum and the activities of the law faculty, which is most commendable. Bryan, if I can come back to the book itself, can I put you on the spot? We've talked about a number of aspects, of CSR and the approach to it, but what are the primary themes through the book? And perhaps I can put the question to you this way: why did you write this book?
Thank you, Marilyn. The motivation was I've had a long-term interest in this, both when I was in legal practice and then in teaching in academia, but also as a matter of governance, in seeing, what do good organisations do, whether they're companies, universities, firms in the profession, or whatever. And so that's been my interest. And then there's been so much that's changed in the debate since I wrote a book about it that was published 10 years ago. And there's so many topical matters involving aspects of corporate and university and professional responsibility and governance that I just thought this was the time to write this book. And I have to admit that being dean doesn't leave you a lot of time, as Stephen would know, that you used to have as an academic writing book. So I suddenly had time at the right time to write the book. In terms of themes, there's a couple of themes in the book which are further explored. But if I can summarize them this way: corporations are part of the problem in causing existential threats, but they are also part of the solution to global existential threats, whether we're talking about climate change, issues of geopolitical security, the threats of AI, as well as its benefits, and so on. There's hardly any multinational company that's not considering issues of geopolitics at the moment. We have the frameworks, whether it's the Paris Agreement, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Rights, or other frameworks. And we have the capability and the resources, but we lack the leadership, the will, and the collaboration in really tackling these things. And what's common to all of those existing frameworks is that they point the way to collective action at scale, across nations, and across the public, private, and community sectors. And these topics, and ESG and DEI, are related to CSR. They're not offshoots of it, but they are related to it. Those aspects, as I've indicated earlier, are already part of Australian law and business regulation and corporate governance standard setting. So no business and no industry and no regulator and no one seriously studying corporations and their governance and responsibility can ignore the topic of CSR and the related topics of ESG and DEI. And they've been under attack, and they've become terms of abuse even in recent times. And so that makes the book, I hope, even more timely for an audience in grappling with these issues. And my purpose was to write a book that would be short enough to pick up at the airport or a local bookshop and read, and small enough and accessible enough that it could be read by anyone who's interested in these affairs. And I have to say, for those who have not yet attempted it, that writing a short, accessible book is harder, much harder, than writing the traditional academic text or a traditional academic article. But I'm pleased with what I've been able to do. And I'm hoping that it will help people who study CSR, people who have to work in business organizations or as regulators of business, or thinking about, as the Economic Reform Roundtable that you referred to, Marilyn, is considering in the week that this podcast is going out, who have to consider issues of business deregulation. I'm hoping that it will help them. And I hope also it will inform the debates that are still going on about controversies concerning social license to operate of business, social license to operate of universities, and social license to operate of the professions that service business, including the legal and business professions.
Well, then, to follow up on that and put Simon on the spot, can I ask you from an economic and business perspective to give a quick book review?
That's putting me on the spot. I would say, having also have a book in this series, I cheated, being in the position of Bryan, and having delivered the book, and it, despite my best efforts being unreadable, we used a ghostwriter to do the hard work of a former AFR journalist. So that was my secret to get it done while dean. Stephen, looking to put something in the series.
We're hoping, we're hoping.
We've
But in
actually been in
terms,
conversation, so yes.
yes.
Okay, excellent.
But, but but in terms of your students,
Yeah.
and I suppose if we take the example of Bryan's business person at the airport, what's the point? Is it a book that's readable?
Yeah, it is actually. You know, a lot of effort goes into making it reasonable and accessible. There's obviously a lot of jargon that needs to be unpacked. You know, even CSR itself is jargon. But yeah, this is immensely, you know, this is really a couple of hours, right? It's not a very long commitment. Explains the issues clearly, why the issues become politicized, and why it's important that going forward it's depoliticized. And I think Bryan definitely covers the fact that, you know, this is about corporations and what do we mean by a corporation, and it really unpacks you know, the fundamental legal question of what is this entity and its purpose, and that is the focus of the exercise, you know, rather than being imposed by some great, you know, social left wing or right wing tidal wave. You know, this is really should be at the existential core of why the organization exists.
Bryan, is there anyone else in the academy who is looking at corporations and their purpose?
There are many people, in short, both in Australia and overseas, who are looking at a company and its purpose, and they're doing it against the background of dissatisfaction with, firstly, the views of Milton Friedman from more than 50 years ago, who famously, in a New York Times article in its title, summarized the argument, which is the business of business is profits, and that's its only social responsibility, profit making. And increasingly, there are academics across a number of disciplines, which here in Australia, who are looking at the limits and weaknesses of the conventional theories, and most of them boil down in terms of either shareholder primacy and value, which aligns with the Milton Friedman view, or with stakeholder pluralism, which is we're looking at balancing the interests of all stakeholders in a company doing things that benefits all stakeholders. But more recently, led by Professor Colin Mayer from the Sade Business School in Oxford, the British Academy funded a major project looking at the future of the corporation. And Professor Mayer and his colleagues have focused upon the notion of corporate purpose, which is now being investigated by a number of academics in Australia and elsewhere, and looking at revitalised interest in corporate purpose. And so the debate about what's the best theory of the corporation is currently seen through a lens of, well, what are the limits of stakeholder pluralism and shareholder value? Shareholder value, for example, has been allowed to develop a lot of short-termism, where people just focus upon the latest stock price and quarterly returns and so on. On the other hand, stakeholder pluralism starts to lose its value and use the more that you get to what we might call outer circle stakeholders. It's easy to see who might be stakeholders if we're talking about employees and creditors and consumers. But if we're talking about the interests of the community and the environment and stakeholders like regulators and government, some of those I just mentioned are not even people, and some of them are so amorphous that it's hard to see how in relation to a particular company they actually count as meaningful stakeholders. So there's limits on traditional theory, and the rise of corporate purpose theory is trying to focus upon what are the real dynamics and complexities of a company creating value, and what are the expectations we have of it in society. And the view of Professor Mayer and his colleagues was that the purpose of business is not profit. Profit is a byproduct of achieving a successful purpose. If I can use a tennis metaphor, tennis players are successful when they keep their eye on the ball, not on the scoreboard. If you watch the scoreboard, you lose. But if you keep your eye on the game and work out how to play the nuances and complexities of the game of tennis, the scoreboard takes care of itself. So that's the sense in which some in corporate purpose theory say that profit is a byproduct of a successful corporate purpose. The greatest example in history of corporate purpose as a mix of public and private purposes, which is what the Future of the Corporation project emphasizes, and also as employee commitment to corporate purpose, occurred when President John F. Kennedy went to NASA and he saw a broom-carrying janitor and he said to him, "What are you doing?" And the janitor reportedly responded, "I'm helping put a man on the moon, Mr. President." And that's the greatest example of corporate purpose with mixed public and private purpose, as I said, and of employee commitment to corporate purpose. Every organization would love to have that kind of commitment. So corporate purpose is playing out in many of the contemporary debates. There is loyally fear of defining something like corporate purpose. The Corporations Act already contains provisions that would let a company set an objective, and that objective could include CSR-related elements beyond simply achieving maximum profits for shareholders. But of course, that's up to each company to do. What the British Academy project suggests is that if you want to make corporate purpose real, you probably need to put it in the law and mandate it, and then let things flow from that. But lawyers fear that if you define something, you might try to control it, but also defining is a way to limit it. And that if you define something like a corporate purpose, that it might be used against the company by somebody who wants to argue that what the company has done is somehow outside the corporate purpose and therefore should be attacked. So that's one lawyerly fear. And the lawyerly skepticism, represented by comments from a number of judges and other commentators, is that the problems in the economy and the problems in the corporate governance and responsibility world aren't due to a lack of corporate purpose and won't suddenly disappear if we suddenly mandate corporate purpose. So there's lots of evidence-based stuff to be done. There's lots of debate still to happen through a lens of corporate purpose. Shareholder and stakeholder considerations are relevant, but they're not the sum total of what matters to a corporation. A corporation has a reputation. A corporation, as a number of recent high-level Australian court judgments indicate, a corporation also has an interest in its own lawfulness and its own ethicality. There are many considerations that affect a company's reputation out there in the market and the community. In addition, there are many Australian laws now that say that companies can intend to do things other than through human actors. So there are a number of Australian academics who are leading the way in looking at systems intentionality. And there are a number of laws that say, although we traditionally, as Simon said, know that a company is a virtual entity, it can only do things through people, but not just through people. A company increasingly has systems. And so corporate cultures and corporate criminality can happen from systems and processes within a company. Similarly, unconscionable business conduct under Australian law can happen and can be examined through the lens of, well, what systems and processes did the company have for dealing with its customers and for dealing with outside stakeholders? And so more and more, it's necessary in looking at those aspects of corporate law to be attentive to the fact that it's not just about shareholders and stakeholders, and it's not just about profit.
And Bryan, in the book, do you highlight particular areas for attention in relation to CSR? For example, the obvious one, climate change. So do you talk about that? Do you talk about other areas?
Yeah, so in the context of setting a broader discussion up front about how we tackle existential threats. It's no good having an economy and it's no good having a company if we're not around because existential threats have overtaken us, whether it's climate catastrophe or the worst imagined threats of artificial intelligence, or the impact of geopolitical security, or mass epidemics, or mass social injustice leading to political disruptions in a number of countries by those who are and feel dispossessed and out of the equation when it comes to sharing in the benefits of a rising tide lifting all boats, which is what is traditionally said when people talk about regulating companies. Well, a rising tide will lift all boats, and it will help poor people as well as rich people, and poor countries as well as rich countries. Well, that's not necessarily played out in the evidence. And so I talk about those kinds of things, and also the fact that we do have frameworks and models of which the business sector and companies are essential in helping us to tackle these very, very difficult existential threats and problems. And I discuss in the book how that high-level global existential challenge meeting is also reflected in the debates we have here about what are the appropriate standards for corporate governance, when should stakeholder interests be taken into account, and how, what are the limits of shareholder primacy and value, what's the role of ESG and DEI, how does a company deal with all of these things, what standards and laws should we set, and how do we do it all with a coherent view to what matters as business success in 21st century society. The conditions under which we developed theories of corporations hundreds of years ago through different industrial revolutions are not automatically the conditions that apply to 21st century corporations in the first quarter of the 21st century, trying to grapple with and do their part in not only achieving value, but doing it in the context of also making a contribution to solving existential threats. In fact, to use the language of the British Academy project, they talked about, and if I can relate this to a focus upon the discussion that's happening this week in the Economic Reform Roundtable, I can summarize what came out of that corporate purpose discussion in one sentence. Have the right policy settings so that companies can make a fair profit in a principled way from solving the problems of people and planet, but without adding to those problems. That's the gist of what comes out of that debate, and that's playing out in the discussions that are unfolding now.
Well, Bryan, so far this evening, we've focused on the corporation and business arising, but CSR is not confined to the corporate institution. It, in fact, is utilised very significantly in other institutions, and I have in mind, in particular, universities. You touch on this in the book. Can you expand on that?
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. The connecting thread through these discussions about what kinds of organisations relate to CSR, the connecting thread is the social licence to operate, because universities and professions that service business all have social licenses to operate, as well as other licenses to operate. And the difference we've seen in the political and media discussion in Australia in the last 12 or so months is the raising of the temperature and the more frequent reference to social license to operate in relation to universities, as well as in relation to businesses. And the common basis for that social license to operate is that the quid pro quo for an organisation like a university, or indeed a company, having a privileged status and privileged benefits and being allowed independence and autonomy, is that they have to meet their social license to operate, and they have to maintain community goodwill and public trust, either directly or as through the elected representatives in politics. And the problem there is that this plays out in a number of very controversial areas currently for universities. They do get the lion's share of funded courses and public funding for funded courses for domestic students. They also get the lion's share of public funding for research that's done, at least at initial stages. They have access to international students, and they have that privilege, which increasingly is being micromanaged by Australian governments. And so they have all of those things and benefits in terms of public funding. But they also are engaged in community engagement and capacity building. Most modern universities have some kind of public statement about ESG and sustainability. And of course, most people watching this podcast would be aware that newspapers every day for more than a year have been full of stories and criticism and micro scrutiny of universities, including law schools across the country, in terms of how they manage issues that are typically characterized in terms of wokeness and indoctrination to particular views, but also in relation to combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia when they arise on campus. And so this is core business now for not just debate about universities, but for the governance of universities. How do you engage with the social license to operate? And how do you regain that to the extent it's been lost by the community and with government? Legal profession is another arm, and law schools and legal academics are just part of the legal profession. The legal profession has its own social license to operate. It supports ideals in public goods, such as access to justice, social justice, the rule of law, the good functioning of legal and justice systems. Many lawyers, professional and academic, support pro bono and engage in pro bono legal work, which is free legal assistance for those who most need it, also in furtherance of access to justice and the benefit of the legal and justice systems. So issues of social license to operate play out for a number of organisations in Australian society across a number of sectors.
Well, indeed, in terms of ESG, Monash is going through its third review. And as I understand and recall the position, universities, when they're assessed for ranking purposes, their scores take account of what they've done in the ESG sector.
Yes, there are now international rankings that specifically focus upon the sustainability and ESG performance of a university. And universities, rightly or wrongly, are very attentive to rankings because potential students and existing students and their families look at international rankings in deciding what country and what university and what faculty and what course they might want to pursue. So there is a very complex ecosystem internationally and within Australia in which these issues of CSR and ESG play out in funding, in rankings, in the focus of courses in business schools and law schools, in opportunities for students, indeed in the skill set for a contemporary student. It's unthinkable that people going out into careers now can avoid issues of corporate social responsibility and ESG and climate change and artificial intelligence and so on. Indeed, one of the doyens of corporate governance, Sir Adrian Cadbury, the late Sir Adrian Cadbury, who was the architect of the UK Corporate Governance Code, which has been followed to one degree or another in other countries, including Australia. He once said that every company has a CSR policy, whether it's articulated or not. The only difference between one company and another is whether they know what their CSR policy is.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, I wonder, given our good fortune in having the two leaders in economics and law with us this evening in this discussion, can I turn first to you, Simon? What does the future hold? Is there hope for CSR from your perspective?
Oh, that's a little scary. So I think, I think the forces Brian's talking about are real. I think, but the fundamental notion is not going away. I think Brian touched on the fact that this is not independent of politics, and I'd like to, remind everybody, particularly when they talk about social license, that it might be things that we don't particularly think are positive, right? It depends who's defining the social license. So that's why I think it makes sense, to follow the approach that our friends at Oxford have initiated, that it should be defined as part of the organisation. To give everybody an old example, the first example of social license that was sort of dreamt up was the Hays Code. Do people remember that? which was Hollywood self-censoring in response to early Hollywood movies showing independent women. So they adopted a social code that anybody who was independent or, an adulterer had to end up a hopelessly broken alcoholic by the end of the film. And so that's an example of social license, I think, being quite harmful. But I honestly think the idea of really purpose-driven organizations is here to stay. And I think defining that purpose will become a core strategic advantage for corporations going forward as consumers have more and more information, as information essentially becomes free. Then I think we'll see the emergence of um, uh, firms' commitment to purpose being essentially a core of where they are and a core of their business strategy rather than, a checkbox add-on.
And Bryan, what do you see? Is there hope?
I think there is hope. There's a lot of things that might doom that hope, as Simon has indicated. But like Simon, I agree that I think some of these things are here to stay. Corporate purpose, ESG, DEI, they might go under the radar for a while, but you have to deal with them, and they're in the law. So again, if they have to be dealt with as part of boardroom obligations, one way or another, then they're going to stay. And in the terms of something like the Economic Reform Roundtable, we can raise the level of public debate and expectations. It's very hard to have a debate about what's good business regulation, how much green or red tape is too little or too much, without having some underlying view about, well, what do we want from business, and what do we want from companies, and what do we expect of them in society? But here's a touchstone and a question that probably won't be aired directly at the Economic Reform Roundtable this week. It'll be interesting to review when this podcast comes out about the impact of this touchstone. What business regulation that reflects and is part of its social license to operate will be left untouched or even added or bolstered after this week's Economic Reform Roundtable? And that's an interesting question to test with evidence.
Well, we will follow it very closely. Bryan, thank you. Congratulations. And as chair of Monash University Publishing, may I say how proud we are of the book. And I do encourage our audience to read it and to be benefited by the reflections that we've had this evening. And I now hand back to you, Steven.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. What an engaging evening this has been. I think I bore my colleagues and my students by repeatedly saying we are in the business of hope in the university, that hope that what we do has impact and meaning. And I think tonight's conversation about people and place and purpose and power offer us some really complex, important questions for our place as educators, as leaders, and for the many corporations Bryan's been speaking about. I remember when the Companies Act was being debated in the UK in around 2006, there was a line which says that a director has an obligation to have regard to various things, the environment, the community, the things that Bryan was speaking about. And when the minister was pressed for what that meant, what does it mean to have regard to? The reply was think about. And I think that's what Bryan is asking us to do, to be more thoughtful, to be more considered, to be more reflective. That's one of my takeaways from this evening. So thank you, Marilyn and Simon, for your care and engagement. Thank you to the University Press. Bryan, of course, thank you for your book and for your vision. Thank you to my colleagues in the faculty, Emily, Karen, Jen, Shia, and Gabby, for all the work that's gone on in the background. Thank you to all of our guests for giving up your evening. It's been very much appreciated. And let me end by saying, take care of yourselves and, if you can, of somebody else as well. Have a very good evening. Goodbye, everybody.